Hello, church. I wanted to take a minute to talk about communion in this season. I know that a lot of people have asked some questions about why we aren't taking communion, and it might seem a little bit crazy, especially from a laity perspective, when you see some churches are having communion, some churches aren't having communion. I wanted to let you know that during this season, we are officially, as of today, not going to be meeting in person through the entire month of April. And so that means the soonest that we could get together is the first week in May, but we might expect that that would go a little bit further. And so it might be a while until we're able to gather together again. Many churches throughout this season have decided that what they want to do is offer communion through online services. And so people would provide their own bread and their own grape juice in their own homes, and the pastor would bless the elements on screen through something like Facebook Live or YouTube or by other means, so that people can participate in communion together in their own homes. Well, we're not going to be doing that, at least as of now. If you aren't a theological nut, you might not know that that is part of a very large discussion that has been going on and is currently going on within the United Methodist Church. In 2013, the General Conference put a moratorium on the practice. So they said, don't do it. We want to spend some time in study. We want to spend some time figuring out if that fits within our understanding of how communion works and the way that God makes his presence of Jesus Christ available through the sacraments. And so the moratorium was put into place. Everybody stopped doing online communion, and pastors waited to hear back. And so a commission was created to do some study and do some putting together of those ideas, and it was supposed to have been presented in 2016. We all know how 2016 went, and that was not upheld or any changes made to the Book of Discipline at that time to reflect their study. My understanding of what the conclusion that they made was that they would not recommend that we end the moratorium on the practice of online communion. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what that means in this season. As of right now, Bishop Palmer, our West Ohio Conference bishop, has put out a statement saying that we can do online communion during this season if we would like to. Of course, it's always up to the pastor's discretion, and the language that they decided to use to allow for this is something called in extremis. It's Latin, in extreme situations. And it's a theological concept that they decided to quote and use it to allow communion online, but only through this season. There's some troubles with that, and some troubles that a lot of United Methodist theologians and those who are particularly interested in our ecumenical relationships. There are some issues with that. The very first one being that historically that has not been consistent with our understanding of how the presence of Christ is made available through the elements. Of course, there's an individual aspect. We come and we partake and we are filled and we experience the salvific grace of Christ. We experience those things as individuals, but it is in the community of Christians that we experience communion. And so, by and large, the statement that many denominations have made, I don't know of any specifically that allow for online communion, but where most denominations have landed is that that's not consistent with our understanding of how community happens to make communion happen. The second problem with this way of looking at it is that in extremis is a Roman Catholic concept. Many of our, especially the Latin ones, are borrowed from historical understandings. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church has existed a lot longer than many of our denominations. And so the in extremis is a principle that is typically only applied to death situations, where people are immediately on the doorstep of death. And it is during that extreme situation that people are able to do baptisms specifically. And that's where that policy comes from. But of course, in this season, we're borrowing this in extremis theology. But the Roman Catholic Church has also barred online communion and hasn't allowed it through this season. And so that's some trouble in that theological claim. A lot of us are just wrestling with it. The second option, so to speak, is what it looks like to use our theology around extending the table as a means of offering communion. Of course, when we do communion here at the church, we have several people who will take those elements to those who are in the nursing homes and serve communion as an extension of our gathering, as a way of making or giving them access to the means of grace and Jesus Christ's presence through the elements, but also as a way of experiencing that community in that extended table. Part of my own discernment and study in this season is how you extend the table when we don't have a table to extend from in this season. And so just know that there is a lot of prayer happening right now in many churches, including ours, about how we can best offer communion and other sacraments in this very difficult season. Like I said, that is going to be a continued source of discernment in my own walk and my own work as a pastor, but at this time we will not be doing online or other drop-in or other kinds of communion offerings. Of course, for United Methodist, historically we've struggled with very similar situations, particularly in the West. Many of our churches are used to having communion once a quarter, and maybe once a month. And that practice really derived out of a necessity because we didn't have pastors in every church. We had circuit riders who would be assigned to a larger community and would go from church to church to church each Sunday. And on the Sundays that the pastor wasn't there, United Methodists and historically Methodists still partook in a community meal that they called love feasts. And so as we go into this season, we're going to be exploring what it might look like for our church to experience a love feast. Typically, the elements that are present are a loaf of bread and a cup of water. We use water because grape juice would tie it too closely to communion and make it be something that it isn't intended to be. But we still use bread because it's still a sustaining source in our lives. But instead of the sacramental grace, the sacramental means of grace, we aren't experiencing that. We're instead going to be experiencing through the love feast the means of grace of sharing our testimony and sharing those ways in which God is working in our lives. Historically, during love feasts, it would be a time of prayer, a time of song, and a time of testimony in which those who participated would offer words telling about how God has been active in their lives and ways that they've experienced His grace throughout the week. And so as we move forward, we're going to be exploring that. I'm going to be creating another video explaining more in depth what a love feast is and what that looks like. And we'll be looking forward to doing that in this season as we kind of put some structure around that. And I just personally need to do more study as to how that looked and how it might look in this season. I pray that God is continuing to be a source of blessing in your life and that you still experience His full grace each and every day, and that you are blessed, especially in this season, to be a blessing.